I avoid horror sequels like the plague. With the exceptions of my favorite horror franchises like Saw and Chucky, I rarely venture into the realm of horror sequels. Most of the time, their sheer reputation is abominable enough for me to stay away, and the older I get, the less I am enthused about watching a movie that I will inevitably have a negative opinion on. However, all of that changes today. In this belated sequel to my original Halloween marathon, I have spent the past 10 months diving headfirst into 31 horror sequels, and unlike last time, rewatches and new releases are not allowed into the tally. Franchises like Child's Play and quality new releases like Evil Dead Rise can't save me now. All 31 sequels must be ones that I have never seen, no matter how much I dread watching them. To help carry me through this experience are some special guests, who will provide some additional commentary that I hope you enjoy. Now, let's get this nightmare started. You may remember me watching the first Wreck during the original Vandalizing Spooktober marathon. I really love that movie, and after watching it, I bought the Wreck box set from Shout Factory. Since then, I still have yet to see the third and fourth movies in the box set, mainly because I knew that they had poor reception by critics and fans. And that was especially deterring since I didn't really care for the second one very much. However, I was pleasantly surprised by the third movie. It's an incredibly different beast from the first two movies, and I think that's why a lot of people really dislike it, but I would argue that its differences are its greatest strength. The plot of this movie has almost nothing to do with the first two. It takes place at a wedding, which of course gets crashed by the zombies from the preceding movies, and from there we get lots of gory deaths, a chainsaw-wielding bride, and a guy dressed up as bootleg SpongeBob. Aside from the story not being a direct continuation of the first two movies, this movie is also a significant departure in genre. About 30 minutes in, it completely drops any facade of being a found footage horror movie. This is something that makes a lot of people mad, but I think it's actually a smart decision. How many times have we criticized found footage horror movies for not justifying why anyone would be recording in a life or death situation? Wreck 3 realizes this problem, and as soon as it stops being reasonable for someone to keep recording, it stops being a found footage movie. I think that works a whole lot better than if it were to come up with some flimsy reason why the main character has to keep recording. In addition to that, the found footage style just wouldn't suit the comedic tone this movie is going for. The movie can be at times very goofy and melodramatic, a lot more than the first two, and I certainly never felt the movie was trying to sell itself as anything more than dumb fun. If you allow yourself to take the movie for what it is, it's hard not to have at least a little fun with its campy tone. I'd also like to note without going into spoilers that the lore of the zombies set up by the first two movies is used here in a creative way that I really liked. Overall, I thought this movie was a lot more fun than it had any right to be, and I think the reputation it has just comes from people wanting it to be a carbon copy of the first movie, which is a mentality I just completely disagree with. How many times do we complain about horror franchises, or franchises in general, just doing the same thing over and over? If we're going to make movies in a capitalist dystopia where nothing can be made unless it's part of some pre-existing IP, then why not make movies like Wreck 3, which use the franchise's title to make something wildly different? It's a lot more refreshing to see something like this than it is to watch a sequel that feels like it was made in a factory by people who are all there just to get a paycheck, which is what most horror sequels feel like. Wreck 3 wasn't the best movie ever, it certainly had things holding it back, but I'd say it doesn't deserve the overwhelmingly negative reputation it has. After the surprise of Wreck 3, I had hopes that the next movie in the series would surprise me as well. However, Wreck 4 is a pretty big disappointment. Not that I had high expectations for it, but the third one made me a little bit more optimistic than I should have been going into this. Wreck 4, Apocalypse, follows the same main character from the first two movies as she finds herself on a boat full of scientists who are trying to find the cure for the zombie disease. Inevitably, a test subject breaks out, and then we get a zombie movie set on a boat. This one has no pretense of being a found footage movie at all. It's just a regularly shot zombie movie, which, as we've established, I don't necessarily take issue with on face value. However, that aside, I did think this movie was pretty boring. Unlike the first one and even the second one, I never really felt much tension or engagement. That first movie was so fun and intense. I've seen it again since I originally watched it for my first Spooktober marathon, and it's still just as fun and thrilling on a second viewing. However, this one struggled to maintain my attention at all. I think my biggest problem with it is the same problem that I had with the second movie, which is that you can't really make a straightforward sequel to the first Wreck. Wreck was such a good standalone movie that not only did it not need a sequel, but it also didn't end on a note that even left room for one. If you wiped all the sequels from existence, it wouldn't change your experience of the first movie at all because it's a very self-contained story. That's why the third one sticks out to me as surprisingly good, because it didn't try to be a direct sequel, but was rather a spiritual successor that had its own story, tone, and style that it was going for. And because of that, it functions as a standalone experience, just like the first movie. The second one tries to be a straightforward sequel, and in doing so, kind of ruins some of the fun of the first movie by explaining things that didn't really need to be explained in order to move the plot forward and justify the sequel's existence. One example of this is bringing the girl from the first movie back, even though her implied death at the end of the first film is what makes that ending so great. Wreck 4 has the same problem. I won't go into spoilers in case anyone watching wants to see this, but there's some explanations for what we saw in the first movie and the origins of the zombie virus that are completely unnecessary and take away from the mystery of that first movie. What they ended up explaining it with isn't even all that scary or interesting, and several plot elements it introduces just seem like they were lifted straight from the Alien franchise. In the end, Wreck 4 is just a bland, ineffective horror movie. I can't really recommend watching it unless you're like me and you're stuck with it because you bought the box set. And it may be apparent already at this point, but I do recommend watching Wreck 3. If you have the right mindset going into it, I think it's actually a pretty refreshing sequel. In theory, Scream 2 should be the perfect sequel. Much like how its predecessor was aware of the tropes that plague the slasher genre, this one is well aware of the negative connotations of horror sequels. However, it really fails to deliver anything fresh. There are definitely highlights. The opening scene in the movie theater is a lot of fun, and in general, anytime someone is in danger, the movie becomes very entertaining. However, the connecting tissue between those scenes of peril feels largely rudimentary. The movie is constantly making snide remarks about how the plot is just a repeat of the original. Meanwhile, it doesn't do anything significant with its story to change things up. As a result, it can't even shield itself from its own criticisms. For the most part, this is very similar to the first Scream, the only changes being that the characters have experienced this kind of terror before, and that the killer is someone new. The killer is something else I'll give the movie. While the journey to get to the reveal isn't exactly a riveting mystery, once the killer was revealed, I genuinely wasn't expecting it, and it wasn't the kind of culprit you usually see. The movie also left some pretty clever clues sprinkled about to hint at who the killer really was. However, again, none of this is largely different from the original film. Aside from a few notable aspects, this is just the first Scream repeated over again, but decidedly less fresh, and with a story that just thinks it's clever as opposed to actually being clever. So many scenes here just feel like half-baked ideas, and sometimes even the ideas themselves are sophomoric in their attempts to be original. The entire movie just feels like a large exercise in going through the motions. I wish there was more to say about it, but ultimately, Scream 2 is just kind of dull. My expectations for Scream 3 were pretty low, but I came out somewhat surprised. It still doesn't hold a candle to the original, but I found myself having a lot more fun and being a lot more engaged with the story this time around. This one gets criticized a lot for having some sillier elements that stretch believability, but that just made it a more fun experience for me. And the meta-commentary in this one does feel a bit more earned since there's enough here to actually make it feel fresh, or at the very least, more fresh than Scream 2. However, at some points, I do think that works to its detriment as well. Without spoiling it, the reveal of the killer is kind of hard to believe. It goes a little too far for me, and it doesn't entirely work. I realized that earlier I just said that some elements of the movie that are hard to believe just make it more fun for me, but this point in particular is where I can see the complaints with the film. While the second movie perhaps doesn't try hard enough to be different from the original, this one tries maybe a little bit too hard to shake things up. Even still, this didn't feel like the been there done that experience of the second Scream movie, so I'm giving it credit for that. And like I said, I had a surprising amount of fun with it. Sure, maybe it's a bit too goofy for its own good sometimes, but I've always liked it when horror movies go into silly camp territory, so I didn't mind at all. The Universal Monsters is a sprawling franchise that I have barely scratched the surface of. I have really only watched the first movie of each of the major monsters, with the exception of Bride of Frankenstein, so I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to watch some of the sequels in this massive series of films. The first monster sequel I decided to watch was Revenge of the Creature. I haven't seen the original Creature from the Black Lagoon in about 5 years, and I remember feeling pretty lukewarm about it. While the scenes with the creature were pretty cool to watch, I remember the rest of the movie being pretty dull. Unfortunately, that's pretty much the case with the second movie as well. The plot progression is more or less the same, only this time the characters want to bring the creature back to civilization and use him as a tourist attraction. It's a good enough premise, but the film moves at a snail's pace, focusing on scenes and characters that just feel like they're there to pad out the runtime. The final 20 or so minutes where the creature finally breaks free of captivity is fun to watch, but for me it comes a bit too late to redeem the movie. I remember liking the first movie a bit more than this, so I think I would say that this sequel was a step down. Something else this movie repeats from the original is the creature's obsession with women. My man's just trying to get laid, and honestly, I respect it. He might have some success if his ghoulish appearance didn't give him negative riz. I don't have too much to say about the second movie overall. I watched it not too long ago and I already don't remember most of it. It's a shame because the premise of the movie is very interesting, but watching it I just found myself bored more often than not. The third movie, The Creature Walks Among Us, is an improvement in that regard. It's about scientists who want to capture the Gill Man to experiment on him and try to turn him into a land creature. I think the plot of this one is executed in a more interesting way than in the previous sequel. Although there are still lots of scenes focusing on the human characters, they actually feel fleshed out, and the moral questions and dilemmas brought up by the experiments make the movie more interesting to watch. It's also the movie that's most sympathetic towards the creature, and that really adds emotional weight to a lot of his scenes. This one can still be dull at times, but it is overall a much more focused movie than its predecessor. I also have to comment on Gillman's strength in this movie. I don't remember how strong he was in the first one, but in this one he is notably stronger than he was in the second film. In Revenge of the Creature, Gillman struggles to break a chain, but in this one he tears down a giant metal fence like it's a piece of cardboard and tosses around big pieces of furniture like they're children's toys. It made the climax of the film more exciting, but also disappointing considering that it abruptly ends at a point where I really felt the movie started to pick up a lot of steam. Overall, I don't have much to say about the Creature from the Black Lagoon movies, which is regrettable because they are iconic and influential parts of the Universal monster canon. I ultimately respect them more than I actually like them. The Elm Street franchise is one that I have a complicated viewing history with. I've mainly stuck to watching the classic original, but I have seen the 3rd and 7th movies in the series. Dream Warriors and New Nightmare were touted as the better sequels in the franchise, so those were the only ones I watched. But now it's time to face my fears and dive into the less revered sequels to fill in my blind spots, starting with the second movie, Freddy's Revenge. I'm gonna be completely honest, I was not prepared for how gay this movie was. Within the first 10 minutes, the main character's pants get ripped and we see his bare ass thanks to a jockstrap he's wearing. Then immediately after, they start talking about gay bars. All of these gay undertones are actually thematically relevant, but we'll get to that later. Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is about Freddy trying to come into the real world by possessing the main character and using him as a physical body. I think it's a really cool concept, and it leads to this Jekyll and Hyde story where the main character is constantly trying to suppress his inner killer. This ties back into the gay stuff from earlier because Elm Street 2 can more or less be read as an allegory for how people in the closet try to suppress their homosexuality. This particular reading doesn't hold up to total scrutiny, but that's certainly the reading that I took away from it. In any case, the film's homosexual themes are pretty undeniable. Everything about the main character and even some of the kills here strongly suggest gay undertones. This thematic reading carries the movie a lot because it's not nearly as intense as the first, and there are stretches of the film that are pretty dull. Freddy himself isn't even present in the movie very much for about 2/3 of it. All of its flaws being considered though, I wouldn't go as far as to say that this is an uninspired cash grab. The concept itself is pretty cool, and it does have some standout scenes. The opening nightmare on the school bus is great, there's a lot of great body horror, in particular a scene where the main character slowly transforms into Freddy, and Freddy himself looks even more disgusting and ghoulish than in the first movie. Obviously, this does not hold a candle to the original, but for something I expected to be bland, forgettable garbage, this was surprisingly creative and interesting to watch, and I think it's a decent sequel. I'm skipping the third movie because I've already seen it, but in short, I did really like Dream Warriors. It's been a minute since I've seen it, so I can't say too much about it, but I do remember enjoying it quite a bit. The fourth movie, Dream Master, is basically in the same vein of the third movie. It follows the same group of characters and has them fighting Freddy in their dreams once again. This one surprised me because it has some really impressive directing and camera work. Dream Master is shot much better than the last two sequels by a country mile. It also has a really good score with a mix of traditional Elm Street music and 80s pop and rock. There's also some really cool set pieces in here with some great practical effects. It's noticeably more 80s than the other movies, but I wouldn't say that that's inherently a bad thing. This is one that gets ragged on a lot because the fourth movie is where the series starts becoming more cartoony, but I honestly didn't mind that change. Freddy may not be intimidating here, but the scenes with him are really fun and I found myself laughing and having a good time regardless. This one also probably has Freddy's best death scene in the whole franchise. All of this being said, this movie is really weighed down by the fact that it's just boring. The story is a nothing burger, the characters are not interesting or entertaining, and you basically just spend the whole movie waiting for them all to die. There's no kind of drama or tension in the movie to really keep you invested in what's going on. Again, I do like the change to a more cartoony style, but unfortunately it doesn't commit to that enough for it to be considered an effective horror comedy. It's clear that a lot of these Elm Street sequels were just complete cash grabs, and even though this one does have a lot of merit, it really does feel like this was just made to capitalize on the success of the previous films, even more so than the previous two sequels. There's enough great stuff here that it could work, but unfortunately it's very apparent that not enough effort was put into the script to make it a good movie. It would not surprise me if the reason the script was so poor was because the screenwriters weren't given enough time to make something good. It's happened before in franchises like Child's Play, where the third installment had an incredibly fast deadline for the script, resulting in a low point for the franchise, and I suspect that's what's happened here. Out of curiosity while writing this, I looked it up and it turns out I was completely right. The script for Elm Street 4 was written in just 9 days, and boy does it show. Aside from the grisly killings that happen in it, not much else goes on in the movie, and that's a damn shame because all of the effort that the director, composer, and special effects artists put into this movie deserves to be in service of a better story. Nightmare on Elm Street 5: The Dream Child is a different story, however. Some of the praises I have for the fourth one are still consistent here. The special effects, body horror, and horror set pieces are truly something to behold. There are so many incredible moments throughout, like the part where Freddy turns into a motorcycle then uses his motorcycle tendrils to turn a guy into a Cronenbergian monster, or the black and white comic book Nightmare that turns Freddy into a monochrome monster, or the entirety of the final set piece. Beyond these scenes though, the movie doesn't have much going for it, and it's clear that at this point all of the Elm Street movies are just being written around the set pieces. In all likelihood, they probably came up with the set pieces first and the story second. And if that's the case, then it really shows. While the fourth movie had an extremely bare-bones script, this one is just completely nonsensical. It feels like everything and nothing happens in this movie at the same time. There's this convoluted plot surrounding the main character's baby and how Freddy wants it or something, and it leads to some genuinely strange scenes. Freddy himself looks worse than ever. His makeup looks like a mask you could buy at the Spirit Halloween store, and while I enjoyed his goofy antics in the fourth movie because it seemed to mesh well with the 80s cheese, here it really clashes with the darker tone and really comes off as unintentionally funny rather than as an intentional gag. It's clear they wanted Freddy to be scarier in this one, but they did nothing to change his behavior from the fourth movie. I enjoyed his scenes for the spectacle they brought, but as a character, he's just kind of dull at this point, only offering a laugh or two throughout the movie, and I'm not even sure those were supposed to be intentional. It is with a wary heart that I continue on to the final film in my Nightmare on Elm Street binge. What's crazy about the final Nightmare is that it's the only franchise film that I've ever seen that starts out by showing a quote from a previous, better movie in the franchise. At this point, it's pretty clear that New Line, the studio behind the franchise, was pretty much just done with it all and shoehorned in this last film to cap the franchise off. They didn't even bother going through the process of getting a talented director, since the person who directed this was a producer on some of the previous films, and it's her first ever directing credit. It's also a movie that was butchered in editing, because apparently the original cut of the movie for this was 2 hours and 17 minutes long, and they chopped it down to 90 minutes. However, it's not like if they didn't cut anything out of this that it would be some kind of hidden gem, because all of the footage that is in the movie is complete and utter dog shit. This is without a doubt the worst Nightmare on Elm Street movie in the original series. So far, I've been pleasantly surprised with the creativity and quality of the production in each of the Nightmare sequels, but none of the compliments I gave to the previous movies apply to Freddy's Dead. Everything here is just terrible. Most of the directing is super bland, the makeup is subpar at best, the acting is abysmal, and the incredible set pieces are gone, replaced by pretty unremarkable special effects that have aged like milk. Worst of all, this movie is tonally all over the place. It's basically like a live-action cartoon, but not funny or entertaining whatsoever. Freddy Krueger descends further into slapstick comedy territory without actually providing any laughs, and his silly antics clash badly with the tone of the movie. The content of the story, the lighting of the sets and characters, the tone of the music, and even the directing strongly suggests that this is supposed to be a scary movie. But not only is it not scary, a lot of the visuals directly contradict this tone. As a result, the movie is neither scary nor funny. This movie's idea of a scary scene is Freddy torturing somebody by running his nails against a chalkboard that he fabricated from thin air. And once again, if this was executed in a more tonally consistent manner, this would be a fun little scene. However, as is, it's completely terrible. It really is a shame, because if the movie had been executed better, it could have been really interesting. There's a lot of neat ideas and themes here related to surrealism and childhood trauma, but none of it is explored in a way that makes the movie worth watching at all. If I hadn't known beforehand that this movie was released in theaters, I would have assumed that it went straight to video, because the production quality is just so terrible here. The climax in particular is pathetically bland and low budget for a series that at this point has prided itself on impressive and creative special effects. If that wasn't bad enough, it ends with one of the main characters saying the title of the movie before cutting to an end-credit sequence that's just a montage of better scenes from the other movies, reminding you of just how fucking awful the movie you just watched really was. And with that, my marathon of the original Nightmare on Elm Street movies is finally over. And while I'm glad I finally watched these sequels as they contained a lot of pleasant surprises, I'm even more happy to be done with them so I can never watch Freddy's Dead ever again. Despite Ring and the American remake of The Ring both being good movies, I've always preferred the original Japanese version, so deciding whether to watch Ring 2 or The Ring 2 wasn't a difficult choice, especially given the sequel for the Japanese original has a lot better reputation, and after watching it, I can see why. This is a sequel that completely nails the tone of the original movie, and instead of the plot being a boring retread of the previous story, it builds upon what that movie set up. It follows a new group of characters trying to investigate the deaths surrounding Sadako's videotape and discover what happened to the characters from the first movie. One element that I preferred about Ring over the remake was the elements of mysticism woven throughout its plot. Ring 2 expands upon this element by delving further into characters with psychic abilities and the effects that has on them as well as the people around them. However, for as much as this movie does right, ultimately it is weighed down by the fact that the mystery presented is not very intriguing. As a result, it's easy to get bored with it and stop paying attention, only to miss important details of the story. One note I'd like to make is that if you haven't seen the original Ring in a long time, you definitely need to rewatch it before watching this one, because this one picks up right where that one left off and has no kind of recap to catch you up to speed. It had been several years since I had last watched Ring, so I actually had to pause the movie and read a plot synopsis of the original to refresh my memory about what happened and who the characters were. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to follow Ring 2 at all. While it is weighed down by low stakes and an overall lack of urgency in anything that's happening, Ring 2 was a lot smarter and more creative than I expected from the sequel to such a classic movie. Like The Ring, choosing between the Japanese Grudge sequel or the sequel to the American remake wasn't exactly difficult, since the remake to me just felt like a stale version of the Japanese film. And again, like Ring 2, this is another J-horror sequel that just gets it right. Although unlike Ring 2, the second Ju-on movie has basically the same story structure as the first, where we follow various stories and characters as they all meet their demise by spirits of the dead. Ju-on has always been a very cool movie to me. The tone and atmosphere it provides is so emblematic of this era of Japanese horror, and along with the dated early 2000s technology featured throughout these first two films, it makes it a very nostalgic experience for me. I just want to make it clear that I did not grow up watching these movies, but you can be sure that I was aware of them. They were inescapable parts of pop culture during the early 2000s, with a reputation for being terrifying. And something about watching these just takes me back to that time and gives me warm feelings of childhood summers in a video rental store being creeped out by the box art of Japanese horror movies just like this. This might be a weird thing to say, but I feel like movies like this are such a time capsule of the 2000s that they should only be watched on an inferior format like DVD, because otherwise, you're not getting the authentic experience. As for the movie itself, aside from my strange sense of nostalgia, it is a lot like the first. It has a really tense, eerie atmosphere that slowly increases a quiet feeling of paranoia, which is especially effective when it subsequently sets your mind at ease, only to then immediately pull the rug out from under you. The scares and kills, aside from being effective, are very creative and cool. The visuals during the horror sequences are just so iconic and memorable even 20 years later. Again, this is nothing that couldn't also be said about the original film, although I did find myself less engaged with the sequel between its scares. Even with that gripe though, Ju-on The Grudge 2 is still a really solid sequel that lives up to the original, and that alone is a pretty impressive feat. While both sequels to The Grudge and Ring are worthy follow-ups to the original, Sadako vs. Kayako is certainly not. This movie had so much potential to be an absolute thrill fest or even just a goofy fun time, and all of it was squandered. To give you a primer as to what to expect from this movie, here's my friend, the worst critic.
White versus blue. Girl versus woman. Hair versus cat boy. The spooky girls are coming. The spooky girls are coming. That was a funny reference to Batman v Superman directed by Zack "The Attack" Snyder, which, funny enough, was released a few months before Sadako v Kayako. Snyder was the blueprint. So Randall asked me to watch this movie because he does not care about my happiness. This movie isn't even funny bad, it's just bad. To be fair to the film, there are a few moments that invoke the funny ha-has out of me. I really loved the Grudge boy because every time you'd see him, he'd be acting like a furry on a bad LSD trip and would just make the funniest meows known to man. Meow! 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 I'm also a big fan of the Naruto psychic who would make funny hand movements in order to manipulate the world around him. Every time he did one of his little hand dances, I pissed my pants from laughter. Besides that, there isn't much else. Catboy and Psychic Man are the only redeeming qualities to this film. Here's some spoilers for Sadako v Kayako. Sadako and Kayako do a Dragon Ball Z fusion dance and become, and I shit you not, Sadakeya. Sadako and Kayako are literally Vegito from Dragon Ball Z. I think lastly, and the main point that I have, is that the rest of this film is so boring. Just don't watch this film. It is free on YouTube, but please just stay away from it. It's a hassle and a half to find a copy that has logical and working subtitles, and it's not worth the time investment to find that copy. At this point, if Randall has already not done so, he should insert a clip of the Catboy here because it's honestly the best part of the film. If he doesn't, please scream at him in the comments. Thank you everyone, I have now left the building.
The movie's plot is basically that the main characters are trying to figure out how to stop Sadako, the ghost from the Ring, and figure the best way to do that is to get it to fight Kayako, the ghost from the Grudge. It's a pretty simple story that should quickly cut to the chase, right? Well, if you assumed that, you'd be wrong. Sadako vs. Kayako is a very boring horror movie that stretches out its thin plot to the point that the titular ghosts don't even fight until the final 10 minutes of the movie. And the fight itself is disappointingly short and undramatic. It takes up about maybe 4 minutes of total screen time, and the ghosts have no interaction with each other prior to that point. This is the kind of movie where you're so bored you can't help but occupy your brain by dissecting every little thing wrong with it. I'm not going to do that in this video, but damn, there's a lot of stuff to fault this movie for. The story, as I said before, is a nothing burger that doesn't even deliver on its premise, and the characters don't even act like human beings. The way they speak and behave is right out of an anime, and I wouldn't even mind that if the entire movie was going for a goofy fun tone, but it's not. The characters don't act the way they do for the sake of comedy, and they often continue acting this way even when the movie is getting serious. There's honestly a lot of silly stuff laden throughout the movie that just doesn't work at all because of the context it's presented in. The goofier elements of the movie clash against the elements that are trying to scare you, leading to some unintentional comedy within the jump scares. I would have been open to this movie taking a sillier route, but I don't think that's what it was trying to do because it's clearly trying to be scary. Unfortunately, there were maybe only 3 moments in the entire movie where I felt any sort of tension happening, much less actual horror. It's a movie that not only doesn't understand how to execute tension, but also doesn't understand the tone of the original movies or how to translate them into a modern context. If the whole movie was a goofy fight between 2 ghosts, I'd be fine with that. If it was a slow burn horror movie that effectively built tension and suspense into a satisfying climax, I'd also be fine with that. Unfortunately, Sadako vs. Kayako is neither of those things. It's just a messy studio movie with a clickbait title that was made to milk both franchises for cash. The original Dracula is a film I admire more than I really like, but something about its sequel, Dracula's Daughter, appealed to me. So I gave it a shot and I liked it quite a bit. It has the same beautiful 1930s studio look, complete with elaborate sets and eerie fog. And while its plot is pretty similar to the original, it's what lies underneath its surface that makes it a much more fascinating movie. Dracula's Daughter continues right from the end of the first Dracula, with Dr. Van Helsing being arrested for murdering the Count. Van Helsing tries to explain himself without looking like a madman, but it's a pretty fruitless effort. This is a subplot throughout the movie and one that I really appreciated. It ultimately doesn't culminate in much, which is a bit disappointing, but what we do get of it is well executed and engaging, as this character tries to convince law enforcement of the existence of vampires. What really makes this movie a standout, though, is the character of Dracula's daughter. At the beginning of the film, she steals Dracula's body and burns it, and we learn that she resents the curse of the vampire, and is seeing a professional to help her overcome her bloodlust. When it ultimately doesn't work, she abducts women in the night and drinks their blood. This is a surprising and rare case of a movie made under the Hays Code which had strong LGBT themes. While not overt, the actions of the character do suggest an analogy for someone struggling with homosexuality in a society that doesn't accept it. Even today, the vampire's hunger for blood has always been associated with romance and sexual attraction, so the decision to make her victims female was certainly not an accident. It makes all of the scenes where she's struggling with her curse all the more interesting when you know that the filmmakers are really communicating a message about accepting one's own lesbian desires in a culture dominated and controlled by heterosexual men. In that way, I think it's a really standout film, not just in the Universal Monsters canon, but in 30s cinema as a whole. It's a strong statement, and a perfect rebuttal for petulant internet personalities that want to pretend like progressive politics in movies is anything new. The marginalized voices of today still existed 100 years ago and were still trying to be heard. And it's pretty amazing that a movie like this was able to break through during a very authoritarian time period in American movies. I usually don't advocate for movie remakes, but I would actually be very interested to see a modern take on this film that capitalized on the lesbian struggles that lie under its surface. I watched the original Slumber Party Massacre last October and I liked it a lot. It's a slasher movie that knows exactly what it is and gives you the boobs and blood you expect while having a lot of fun doing so. There's also some feminist subtext in the film if you're the kind of horror fan that likes digging into the themes of horror movies. I don't want to spend too much time going into detail about it, but I thought Slumber Party Massacre was a lot of fun. So when I found out it had a sequel and saw this was the poster, I had to see it. Slumber Party Massacre 2 has every reason to be a complete failure, as from the start it feels like a lazy cash grab, but the movie quickly reveals that it has a lot to offer. It follows one of the survivors of the first movie as she deals with nightmares and hallucinations caused by her traumatic experience. The first 2/3 of the story is basically a psychological horror film, albeit one that doesn't take itself very seriously. A lot like the first movie, Slumber Party Massacre 2 is full of comedy, whether it be intentionally written into the script or unintentional due to the poor performances of the actors. On that note, I do have to give a shout out to the scene where the chicken in the fridge jumps out and attacks the main character. Even throughout its more mundane sequences, there's an eccentric style of absurdity that the film proudly wears on its sleeve, like during the actual slumber party when the girls start dancing, and the way it's filmed and edited is like a parody of shitty music videos. When the film's guitar-wielding killer finally reveals himself during the last 20 minutes, the movie gets even more fun as it completely goes off the rails. This guy does an entire musical number before killing someone, will constantly make corny references to popular rock songs, and will randomly just stop to shred on his guitar drill. As you can probably tell at this point, this is not a horror movie that takes itself seriously at all. It's a ton of fun, and I enjoyed it nearly as much as the first one. It'd be easy to write this one off as bottom of the barrel trash, but it's a surprisingly unique slasher movie, and you'd be missing out if you skipped it or its prequel, so I definitely recommend them both. Scanners is one of my favorite David Cronenberg movies, if not my all-time favorite Cronenberg movie. It's a science fiction thriller about an underground group of people with mysterious psychic powers. Out of every Cronenberg movie, this one has the most potential for a franchise, so I guess it's no surprise that it spawned a number of sequels. The first being Scanners 2: The New Order. To help me get started on the Scanners sequels is my fellow YouTuber Katie of the Night, who will also be giving her thoughts as a fellow first-time viewer. Scanners 2 follows a new group of characters separate from the first movie. The main character finds out he has the powers of a scanner and gets wrapped up in a group of scientists and politicians who want to control the scanners and use them for their own means. And they do this by getting them addicted to drugs that suppress the side effects of their scanning abilities. One of the group's members runs for political office with intentions to use the scanners as a special law enforcement group. So the fact that there are 2 Scanner Cop movies after this makes a lot more sense.
It quickly became obvious that Scanners 2 just did not have that same magic touch that we got from Scanners 1. Scanners 2 has this very full moon features kind of vibe to it, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but in this case, I feel like it was a bit too cheesy because Scanners 1 is obviously a very serious movie. So Scanners 2 did have some style at times, some stylish moments. One of the first that I noticed was the warehouse scene at the beginning and the light and shadow they had going on there. But generally the film felt more like a TV movie, which makes sense because cinematographer Rodney Gibbons actually had been working in TV up until this point. But they sure did try their best.
The movie surprisingly expands upon the lore of the Scanners, introducing some cool new abilities. Although I will say the movie does take it a bit too far by including telekinesis in their powers. In the first movie, the most they could really do is scan computers, read people's minds, maybe stop them dead in their tracks, and make their heads explode. In this movie, however, there's a couple of scenes where they use their powers to shove people into walls. It isn't used very frequently, even in situations where it would make sense, and it honestly doesn't make sense why this is incorporated at all besides for dramatic effect. Beyond that though, the expansion of psychic powers in this movie is pretty natural, and it's cool to see new writers taking what Cronenberg established and building on it.
So for me, I felt like the sound design was not quite there. Not to be constantly comparing to part 1, but particularly the scanning bits I found to be a lot less effective, largely because of the sounds. Or lack thereof. And the greater story as a whole was a lot less haunting without those eerie, otherworldly sort of sound effects that we had woven into the score of Scanners 1. So the scanning here in Scanners 2 felt a lot more goofy and a lot less body horror. And for some reason here in Scanners 2, the act of scanning or being scanned is not being portrayed as painful anymore, which takes a lot of the fun out of it, a lot of the horror out of it. And a lot of times the scanning just wasn't very convincing to me. That was partly because of the acting too. The acting here made the film seem a lot less serious. And tonally, much of the darkness we got in Scanners 1 has been replaced with cheese here in Scanners 2. We even get a slow saxophone solo during a solemn confessional moment.
Telepathic things, I guess. I don't know. I've never really understood it.
Despite the goofier tone, the story in Scanners 2 is surprisingly good, especially when it starts diving into the history of the main character. Because of the dominoes that this movie sets up, it has family drama and political drama on top of the usual thrills you would expect from it. I also have to give a shout out to the makeup and special effects in this movie, because while it isn't as great as what Cronenberg does in his movies, there's still some really cool body horror executed here.
I feel like they really tried to outdo Scanners 1 when it came to the effects and the body horror. I was very surprised to see a lot more body horror action in this film. I also saw that they probably very intentionally took from Scanners 1 in just having a very high kill count. A lot of people get killed, including people that you don't expect are going to get killed, which is the same kind of surprises that you got in Scanners 1. So they definitely tried to match that brutality. Nobody in this movie seems to have a no-kill policy of any sort. Everyone is just really vicious. And I have to take a moment for the best part of this movie, and that was the convenience store scene kind of towards the beginning. This was incredible. The way the robbers just like swoop in the blink of an eye before anyone even knows what's happening, and then everything that happened after that, I had chills the whole entire scene. That was supreme. And that's when something clicked for me as a first-time viewer of Scanners 2. That's when I became a lot more receptive to the movie. I was like, okay, maybe this will be okay. They've done something right here.
However, it's just not that one scene. There's a lot of material in the script that could make for a great movie, but unfortunately, it is held back by subpar execution in pretty much every department. It feels unintentionally silly, and most of it is pretty dull to watch. Had this movie been helmed by a better director, it could have been something really special. Even with the middling execution of the movie, there are still scenes and sequences that stand out as really effective, particularly within the last 30 minutes, and I think that's a testament to just how good the material in the script was.
Scanners 2 was an extremely ambitious undertaking. They really went in hard. This film is stuffed to the brim. You might even say overstuffed. It felt long, even though it really wasn't that much longer than a normal movie. Things get really crazy. I mean, this story has a lot more going on, but the story isn't bad at all, although it might have a little too much in there. It was still an enjoyable watch. Like, it was interesting, fun, exciting, and it's especially fun to watch with a friend because there are a few things to laugh at and poke fun at.
As Katie said, for all intents and purposes, this is a much better movie than it should be. But unlike Katie, I would say that it just isn't good enough for me to give it a full recommendation or even say that I like it. If you're super interested in watching all of the Scanners movies, then I can't say it's a total waste of time, as there really is some cool stuff in here. But this is one that ultimately just makes me wish it had been handled better, because if it had been, it truly would have been a worthy sequel to the original. I don't have any real way to segue into Scanners 3 because this movie is so different from the previous two movies and has almost nothing to do with them story-wise. While the second Scanners movie at least tried to build upon the world that the first movie set up with middling results, Scanners 3, The Takeover, takes the general concept of the first movie and does something entirely different with it. It doesn't continue the story from the first movie or the second movie in any way, and while that's disappointing, I got over that pretty quickly when I realized that this series had finally hit goofy camp territory. Scanners 3 is about a woman with scanner powers who was adopted by a scientist, who is working on an experimental drug to help cure scanners. His daughter takes this drug before it's ready, and it turns her into a power-hungry murderer as she quickly sets her eyes on using the power of the scanners to take over the world. This movie is a cartoon. It is a very violent and horny cartoon, but it is a cartoon nonetheless. I expected the series to hit goofy territory at some point because there are sequels called Scanner Cop, but it happened way sooner than I expected. The second one was a little goofier than the first, and I expected this one would probably be a little bit more goofy than that, but I never expected that it would tilt this hard into complete absurdity.
Darn, I hate the way the flash makes their eyes go red.
Everything about this movie is so silly and non-serious. You have this drug that's really more like a little gadget that you stick onto your skin. Think of it as the scanner's equivalent of a nicotine patch, but it inexplicably turns people who wear it into maniacal madmen. All of the previous rules about how the scanner powers work have been completely thrown out the window in this movie. The main antagonist uses her powers to make a man dance around in a crowded restaurant, strip, and throw himself into a piano. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. She also explodes a bird just by looking at it, and, uses her powers to sexually harass and rape one of her subordinates. There's actually a lot of sexual assault in this movie. It's really off-putting.
Boys, I think we've got us a rapist.
Aw, come on, Mitch. He was willing.
But then again, the movie is also pretty horny in general, which I can't get into too much detail about without this entire video getting demonetized. But trust me when I say there's a good bit of sex and nudity here. What really sets this movie apart though is that it's essentially just an action movie. The whole first act setting up the main character as the villain is just so it can introduce her brother, who for some reason is living far away with a bunch of monks, and it introduces him via a kung fu fight where he beats everyone by using his scanner powers to throw them into shit. If there's a scene with the brother character in it, it's probably going to turn into an action scene out of nowhere.
Hi there.
By the time the third act rolls around, it's just scene after scene of car chases, shootouts, and explosions. The final battle between him and his sister involves the sister pointing a laser at her brother and the brother overcoming it by practicing Zen meditation. I'm not sure if this is a case of a movie being funny on accident or if it's just funny on purpose, but either way, I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would, and I'll probably come back to it a lot sooner than I will the second movie. Now we have finally arrived at the Scanner Cop movies. I expected Scanner Cop to be a goofy continuation of the Scanner Cop idea from the second movie, but surprisingly, neither of those things is true. This is shockingly the most serious Scanner sequel so far, and is probably the closest in tone to the original film. The plot setup also has nothing to do with the concept of a scanner police force as set up in the second Scanners movie. The story is about a boy who is taken in by the leader of the police department after the death of his father. From there, it follows his exploits as a rookie cop using his scanner abilities to unravel a mystery involving members of the police force who are being brainwashed into killing other officers. I was really looking forward to this one, so I am happy to report that Scanner Cop is the best sequel of the Scanners franchise. The plot of the movie reminded me of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex and the way it used its science fiction premise to enhance its police procedural story. However, considering standalone complex came out nearly a decade later, it was more than likely influenced by The X-Files, which started airing a year prior to this movie's release on home video. The story is pretty engaging throughout, and it has quite a few scenes of legitimate tension, elevating the movie past a basic police procedural and into the realm of a science fiction thriller. The scenes of scanners using their powers are the best since the original film. The previous sequels didn't know how to capture what David Cronenberg was able to accomplish in the first movie. In that movie, you could feel the psychological tension every time the scanner had to fight an enemy. In the sequels, scanning confrontations either felt silly or just like two people having a staring contest. When the main character uses his powers, you really feel like there's something happening other than just a guy staring at the camera really hard. And while part of the difference can be attributed to better writing and directing, a large part of it is thanks to the performance given by the lead actor Daniel Quinn, who offers the most intense performance I've seen in any of the Scanner sequels. He really helps sell the idea that he's straining himself when he exerts his powers. The makeup and special effects used when someone is being scanned is also much improved from the third sequel, with the particular standout being when a man's forehead sprouts 3 tiny baby heads. The biggest surprise of all came when I looked into why this movie felt like such a return to form, and it was because the director is Pierre David, who produced several of Cronenberg's movies, including Videodrome and the original Scanners. His experience working on those previous films is apparent, because while it isn't as strange or stylish as an actual Cronenberg picture, Pierre really understood what made the original work, and does his best to replicate it here. Taking it for what it is, my biggest issue with the film is the villains. Their actions are necessary for the plot to move forward, but everything about who they are, what they're doing, and why they're doing it is so vague and barely existent that they felt hardly intimidating. The villains really clash with the more serious tone the movie is going for, because everything about them, from their method of brainwashing to the way they present themselves physically, feels like it's from the Power Rangers. That complaint aside, Scanner Cop was still a huge surprise, and is my favorite out of the Scanner sequels. It got a 4K re-release by Vinegar Syndrome last year, and I am strongly considering picking it up at some point, because I thought this movie was pretty cool, and I'll probably want to revisit it in the future. With how much I enjoyed Scanner Cop, I was looking forward to watching its sequel, Scanner Cop 2: The Showdown. And while not as good as the first Scanner Cop, I can still say it didn't totally disappoint. The lead performance by Daniel Quinn is once again way better than these direct-to-video movies deserve, and the scanning scenes are intense with gruesome makeup and effects. The villain here is also greatly improved. Scanner Cop 2 is about our main character tracking down a rival scanner, Vulcan, who is absorbing the power of other scanners to become a stronger killer. The villain here is a much more intimidating threat than the cartoony and out-of-place foes of the first film. He really gives the main character a run for his money and presents a formidable challenge. However, undercutting all of this is the story, which is not nearly as engaging as the previous film. For much of the runtime, the film stays in a repetitive cycle of the police searching for clues and evidence after the brutal killing of an innocent scanner. The individual scenes themselves are fine, but the way they're stitched together creates a monotonous routine that lasts until the final 20 minutes of the movie, where things finally start moving again. Also somewhat disappointing is the breadth of the scanner's powers, which have once again been broadened to include some pretty ridiculous feats. But thankfully, this does not diminish the effectiveness of the scenes where they use their powers. The movie even uses the expanded abilities to make the final conflict between Sam and Vulcan much more interesting and visceral. While the movie did not retain Pierre David as a director, he did stay on to produce, which is probably why the movie is so effective despite its shortcomings. Then again, he also produced Scanners 2 and 3, so maybe Steve Barnett, the director of this movie, deserves more credit than I'm giving him. In any case, the point is that while having bigger shortcomings than its predecessor, Scanner Cop 2 is still an effective science fiction thriller, and certainly better than what you would expect from a direct-to-video sequel to a direct-to-video movie.
I'm waiting for you, Scanner Cop!
And with that, until the Scanners HBO series that's in development releases, that is all of the sequels in the Scanners franchise. A lot of them were certainly better than I expected, and if anything I said about them piqued your interest, I would recommend giving them all a watch. If you only want to watch one Scanners sequel though, I think it's pretty clear that my recommendation would be Scanner Cop. It stands head and shoulders above the rest and is closest in quality to the original film despite its direct-to-video budget. I'm really glad I gave these a watch, because they were an interesting and fun experience. The first two Frankenstein movies are my favorite Universal monster movies, so I was excited to watch the third installment, and Son of Frankenstein did not disappoint. Full disclosure, I watched all of the Universal monster movies in this video with a friend who is a monster movie fanatic. So while we were watching this, he was filling my ear with all sorts of trivia about how they cut the budget for the movie. Despite this being the case, it's still a beautiful movie, using what it has to its full advantage through set design and lighting that harkens back to German Expressionism. Another piece of trivia my friend told me is that Boris Karloff advocated for Bela Lugosi to be in this movie as his career had diminished after Dracula. Learning that was pretty shocking because Bela Lugosi does a fantastic job as Igor. Between the makeup and his stellar performance, he completely melts into the character. Had I not been told it was Bela, I probably wouldn't have even recognized him. That such a fantastic actor's career could falter is a sad fact, but I'm glad that this movie was able to give him a second wind. I also really enjoyed the stories and themes of the film. The movie is about the son of Dr. Frankenstein who inherits his father's estate, and slowly rediscovers his father's work, as well as his fascination for it. The Frankenstein movies have always been about the monster as a misunderstood outcast, but what I find interesting about this film is that it doesn't focus much on the monster at all. Instead, that same theme is continued in Frankenstein himself. The movie really emphasizes how the entire family name of Frankenstein is marred due to the events of the first two films. And that makes the main character of this film an outcast, as the townspeople unfairly scrutinize him based on his family heritage. I like how the film approaches the discovery of his father's work. It feels imbued with respect and reverence for the previous two films in such a way that it helps the movie feel as if it's continuing on a great legacy, which I suppose is fitting given the story. Honestly, you could almost call this the first legacy sequel in that regard, only this wasn't made with the intention of rebooting an entire franchise. I love the characters of the movie. Obviously, Igor is the standout, with Bela's performance as the conniving character, but the inspector is also a fantastic character that provides a good bit of the movie's conflict. I also love how both characters have a physical quirk that makes them stand out, and that gives them a personal backstory that makes their motivation for driving the plot forward very personal. Where the film seriously falters is the ending. Made during the Hays Code era of Hollywood, Son of Frankenstein not only contains no explicit violence, it also has an ending so nonsensically positive and happy that it flies in the face of everything the themes of the movie were trying to accomplish. It really puts a damper on what ought to be a really great movie. Beyond that, Son of Frankenstein is a really good movie that I clearly need to add to my collection of Universal monster films. I'm not a big fan of the Halloween franchise. In fact, I don't even really care that much for the first one. Don't get me wrong, I respect it, but it's really just not for me. It's not scary to me whatsoever, and unlike other slashers like Friday the 13th, which are still fun to watch even if you're not scared of them, Halloween doesn't really fall into that category because it takes itself too seriously. I have only seen the first two Halloween movies and Halloween 2018. I had no plans on watching any more films in the franchise, although I do have a morbid curiosity about the Rob Zombie films, but through happenstance I came into DVD copies of Halloween 3 and 4, so I thought why not go ahead and give them a try. I'm actually going to walk back my previous statement a bit because despite not being really interested in the franchise as a whole, I've wanted to watch Halloween 3 for quite some time. I find the original idea for the Halloween series, that being an anthology of different horror stories that are set during Halloween, to be much more compelling than the continuing saga of Michael Myers. I also greatly prefer the concept for Halloween 3, which is about an evil corporation that is making Halloween masks deceptively marketed as children's toys, when in reality they are tools for a much more sinister plan. Now overall, I didn't really care for this movie, but there were things that I did like about Halloween 3. The plot serves as an examination of how corporations and their products prey on children, and how billionaires turn technology against us for their own nefarious purposes. And that's something we're seeing in real life right now with the rise of AI. So thematically, I really enjoy the movie. It also had some pretty intense moments in it. Particularly, there's a scene where a woman's face is blown off and the makeup is some of the most disturbing makeup I've seen in any horror movie. Some of the other parts I liked are more spoiler territory, so I won't detail them, but there were definitely some standout scenes in this that I really enjoyed. However, what kept me from really liking this movie is that it commits the sin of being pretty boring. The story plays out like an investigation into this factory that's making the masks. There's plenty of ways you can make that story engaging, however, Halloween 3 doesn't effectively do that. I found most of it to be pretty dull, and I was thoroughly ready for it to be over by the time it ended. Once again, there are highlights and there are things about the movie I like overall, but the script and direction just aren't up to par with the concept of the story or the production quality of the special effects. Even with that being said, I think it's a shame that the idea for this franchise was completely axed because people wanted more Michael Myers. Once again, I am frustrated by the narrow-mindedness of certain horror fans and their insistence on wanting the same movie over and over. I personally really like the idea of a franchise that's just a vehicle to tell completely different stories with one theme or concept uniting them all. If I was ever put in charge of starting a franchise, that's probably exactly what I'd try to do. I think had they not made Halloween 2 focus on Michael Myers, we may have gotten the Halloween franchise that was originally intended, but as it stands, Michael Myers reigns supreme, for better or for worse. However, Halloween 3 has its fair share of fans, and on that note, I've invited Liam Does Stuff to give further thoughts on this film as someone who has a special childhood connection with it.
Hi there, Liam Does Stuff here. I've taken a great liking to Halloween my whole life, and as I've grown older I prefer Halloween over any other holiday by a landslide. There's a kind of silly righteousness around Halloween being your favorite. All the cacophonous, depleting commercialism of Christmas is corny, man. But we may or may not forget that Halloween is largely about making a profit too, right? Does it make it a better cause compared to Christmas if it's about celebrating death and eating sweets and parading around as Harley Quinn instead of being with those you love and spreading cheer and exchanging gifts? And, well, that just sounds one-sided, especially if I'm trying to preach a defense of Halloween and not defame it. Disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed, maybe? Those who vicariously enjoy Holly Jolly Christmas are otherwise mean, and those who like the mean holiday are nice? All kinds of philosophy at play here, but I'm actually here to talk about the movie Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. If you're familiar with the Halloween/Michael Myers franchise, then you're likely aware of the mortification of Halloween 3, being often informally addressed as the one that doesn't have Michael Myers in it. The behind-the-scenes conflict of interest story has been exhausted on YouTube videos pertaining to anything Halloween 3. Halloween 2 wasn't exactly a passion project, and Dino De Laurentiis gives Carpenter's anthology idea the green light. Tommy Lee Wallace is attached to direct, and then, in one of the greatest marketing tragedies in the history of horror pictures, or perhaps pictures period, audiences felt duped into forking over cash to a Myers-devoid movie. But recently, you can see that there are those who've warmed up to it, proving that just because there's a dissonance between what you want and what you got, doesn't always mean that what you got sucks. It rings truer now that the general public has long acquired what they begged for: Michael Myers without any sign of a bottom for the pit. Isn't David Gordon Green's awful HBO Max patented trilogy any signal that perhaps rearing towards more of a diverse output for Halloween was the way to go? Little known fact is that my first real deal horror film was 1982's Creepshow. Thanks for gifting me with the horror genre, Mum. And to this day I'm a sucker for a good anthology. To think that Myers and the Silver Shamrock story coexist, at least in terms of filmography and not the canon, except for that cute little TV spot during a scene in the bar. It's a shame how many potentially great and unique films we will never see under the Halloween name. All we have is the sole remainder. Tom Atkins as the alcoholic schlub Dr. Daniel Chalice has seemingly slept with every female colleague in the hospital, and his girlfriend Ellie Grimbridge is on the younger side.
Waiter. How old are you?
Chalice, Grimbridge. Fittingly hokey names. You could cut those bits out and it really wouldn't matter. Doesn't make for the most sympathetic protagonist. The androids aren't very intimidating and sort of a half-baked idea that gooses the audience later on in a way that's a little too goofy, even considering other events that happen in this. But the funny part is that Halloween 3 for me scared me more than anything from the first two. And in the age of frivolous conspiracy, this movie is quite relevant. An advertisement broadcast acting as a kind of psyop using old-timey witchcraft and new age technology to kill children all across the United States via microchip. That Silver Shamrock jingle sure is an earworm. The main villain, Colonel Cochran, played by national treasure Dan O'Herlihy, is actually against the notion of commercialism in his scheme. The end goal isn't profit, but rather sacrificing children in the name of the grim, sadistic origins of the Halloween season.
You thought no further than the strange custom of having your children wear masks and go out begging for candy.
He brings up a great point about the safety falsehoods of Halloween. This celebration is admittedly plagued with cruel pranks and bad weather. Children statistically are twice as likely to get hit by a car, and you break the golden rule of not just talking to strangers, but taking candy from them. We stole Halloween from those who used it as an excuse for satanic misdeeds. We misappropriated it as some sort of get-up convention, and then we just assumed that nobody would rebel. Cochran is just taking back what's rightfully his. I don't know about you, but that's one of the coolest motivations ever. There are images in this movie that are burned into my mind forever. In my younger youth, Season of the Witch was always the one I'd skip. 30 minutes go by, no sign of a Shatner mask, so I'm gone. One fateful October, I humored the idea of watching all of it just to truly cement my boredom, and maybe get a measure of the enemy I was so severely at odds with. And, to my surprise, the misfire scene and the kid's head deteriorating, yeesh, what a visual. Brute force and stabbings you can get used to, but these are creative, the worst kind of murder. Dean Cundey returns to do cinematography as he did the previous Halloweens, and that iconic, cold, desiccated, and thin look of Carpenter projects gives me a bit of nostalgia for a period that came and went before I was born. Also, did you know Jamie Lee Curtis has a voice cameo twice?
It's 6 o'clock. It's 6 o'clock. Curfew. Curfew. What more did you have?
Yes, information.
I'm sorry, we cannot complete your call as dialed. Please hang up and check the number and dial again.
There's budgetary constraints that were handy for the making of the film, but they supply commentary within the universe of the movie as well. The limited selection of generic masks made it so that they don't have to spend so much on duplicating dozens of designs. But that matches the intentions of the company themselves, as well as the Silver Shamrock jingle, which you again can't not mention is so dubiously catchy in an annoying way, is just London Bridge is falling down with swapped lyrics. London Bridge is public domain. The masks are cheap crap, and yet with the power of marketing, Silver Shamrock is able to turn them into a fad. Normally kids want to be a superhero or a princess or something more recognizable, but they're easily persuaded by that damn television set. While we're on the topic of annoying sounds, the soundtrack composed by John Carpenter and Alan Howarth may not be everybody's cup of tea, but I personally adore it, and I listen to it often. It's a must-listen if you're into Carpenter soundtracks or classic electronica in general. You know, it's a charming little movie. Not perfect, but worthy. And I'm certainly glad we were able to re-examine and speak about it more enthusiastically. I'd like to also sincerely thank Randall for bringing me on, and it's been a pleasure talking about Halloween 3.
Considering I haven't really thoroughly enjoyed a single Halloween movie that I've watched, I wasn't exactly going into Halloween 4 with high expectations. In fact, I was honestly expecting this to be really bad. I mean, it's Halloween 4. The number in the title is enough of a deterrent to keep me away forever. However, I come before you today absolutely dumbfounded, because Halloween 4 is not only not bad, it's actually pretty good, and probably my favorite Halloween movie. It of course takes place after Halloween 2. Laurie Strode is dead for some reason, but she did leave behind a daughter, and Michael Myers is after her. It seems like pretty low-hanging fruit in terms of a sequel plot, but it's the execution that matters here. Regardless of how flimsy the setup is, everything in this movie is considerably better than any of the other Halloween sequels or reboots that I've seen so far. The camera work and cinematography in this was surprisingly good. This movie knows how to use framing to build ominous tension, and it also gets creative with how it moves the camera for maximum impact. This is the first Halloween movie I've watched since the first one where Michael Myers actually feels like an intimidating presence. A large part of that is how he's presented visually from the camera, but another part of it is that he's just different in this movie. In my opinion, in this movie he is far more ruthless and brutal than he was in the previous movies. I could be misremembering, but he just comes off as far more relentless here. And that's also shown in the creative kills and set pieces in the movie. Once again, I remember the first two Halloween movies being a bunch of stabbing. If someone died, they were probably stabbed to death. Here, that isn't really the case. You've got people who die by strangulation, electrocution, and there's even one person who he kills by ramming a shotgun through their abdomen. He doesn't even pull the trigger, he just uses his raw strength to drive the shotgun through them and the wall behind them. It's pretty crazy. In the previous movies, a lot of the more tense scenes tended to take place in the same location. In Halloween 4, it's much more varied. We have scenes taking place inside of a house, of course, but also on the house's roof, on the hood of a car, in gas stations, in schools. It was a lot more interesting to watch in that regard. I also thought the score was really good. It of course used the classic Halloween theme, but it also had some bassy, more industrial sounding music throughout the movie that I thought was really effective. And this has probably the best characters in any Halloween movie that I've seen. Not that they're fantastic, but unlike previous Halloween movies, these characters seem like actual people, and it's a lot easier to care about what's going on as a result. Their dialogue and their relationships with each other just seemed very real, and it was pretty refreshing considering that even in the first movie, I thought the characters were pretty annoying and one note. To top all of this off, it also has a great twist ending. It does come out of nowhere, but I think it's a great ending. So yeah, I am completely floored. Not only was this not dog shit like I was expecting, it's actually the only Halloween movie so far that I have thoroughly enjoyed from start to finish. I think what sets this one apart for me is probably the same reason why a lot of fans don't like it. It's a little more goofy and fun. A movie where Michael pins someone to the wall with a shotgun barrel is clearly not taking itself as seriously as the original, and considering my problem with the original was the lack of any fun, I am personally very okay with that shift in tone. I do want to note here that I don't think that every horror movie needs to be like this really fun romp, but the first Halloween in particular I feel like could benefit from a little bit of that. I just wanted to add that little aside just in case someone gets the wrong idea. I usually have no desire to watch the Halloween movies, but I have a feeling I'll be revisiting this one in years to come. I've been meaning to watch the sequel to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for years now. It has a pretty good reputation despite the overwhelming consensus that it's not like the original at all, and after watching it I'd say I agree on both counts. This movie is a lot sillier than the first, and it sometimes comes off as a live-action cartoon parody of the original movie, and I don't mean that in a bad way because this change was clearly intentional. It uses the cartoony presentation to satirize elements of the original, like having Leatherface be an easily manipulated moron, or by commentating on the final girl trope, bringing attention to how she's at once a sex object, a motherly presence, and a hapless victim, but rarely a strong character who makes it through the movie due to her own agency as a character. And the movie's just pretty fun overall. There's a chainsaw duel with Leatherface at the end, a character that uses a wire hanger to pick at his metal-plated skull, and their lair is like an expensive haunted house attraction. I honestly don't have that much to say about it. It's a fun, smart sequel, and while I prefer the original, I'm glad I finally got around to watching this. Return of the Living Dead is one of my favorite zombie movies, and I didn't even know it had sequels until I was looking at horror movies to watch for this video. While the second one didn't interest me too much, the poster for the third one really grabbed me. I decided to jump into it first, and it turns out that wasn't a bad choice. Besides the title, the third movie has no connection to the first two at all, so I'm not missing any context here. Return of the Living Dead Part 3 follows two punk rock teens as they stumble upon their father's military base where they experiment on zombies. After the main character's girlfriend dies, he takes her back to the facility in hopes of bringing her back to life. And the rest of the movie is the couple being pursued by various groups of people while the female protagonist slowly turns into a zombie. This was a lot better than I expected it to be. It looked intriguing from the onset, but I was mostly expecting B-movie schlock, and we certainly do get that here. There's a lot of campy goofiness in the movie similar to the original. There's a character in the movie called the Riverman who lives in a sewer, a Mexican family on a nonsensical revenge rampage against the main characters, a lot of zombie killing, and as you see in the poster, the girlfriend in the movie eventually transforms into this zombified badass with glass shards and pieces of metal sticking out of her body. It's honestly a really cool monster design, and it's a shame that it's only in the movie at the very end. However, while these campy elements are there and they're fun, what really surprised me about the movie was how seriously it took the emotions in its story. The story beats work pretty well here, especially if you look at everything happening in the movie as a symbol for dealing with a traumatic experience. I'm going to go full spoilers here, so if what I've said so far intrigues you and you don't want the movie to be spoiled, I recommend jumping ahead in the video. In my view, the way the movie handles Julie's transformation into a zombie is surprisingly realistic to how one might be affected by a traumatic, near-death experience. At first, she just doesn't feel right about herself, and she has trouble processing what happened. But then it starts to change her behavior. Her appetite changes. She doesn't like eating the same foods anymore. She doesn't allow herself to eat. Her mood and personality has shifted, and it starts to affect her relationship with her boyfriend. There's a moment here when Kurt says,
"All I want is for things to be the way they used to be. I like you the way you were before."
And that really hit me and convinced me that's what this movie was communicating thematically. After this, Julie is so distraught over her trauma and sudden transformation that she turns to self-harm and even attempts suicide. She survives the suicide attempt, but she's a shell of her former self. Eventually, her boyfriend can't help her on his own, and he has to seek professional help, so she's institutionalized. At the end of the movie, Kurt is bitten by a zombie, and despite his father pleading with him to leave Julie, he commits to staying with her, and they die together in the fire. When you're in a relationship with someone who's struggling mentally, it's difficult, it's a challenge, and it even changes you for better or for worse, but you stick with them anyway because you love them. The only part of the movie that doesn't fit into my interpretation is the point of the climax where Julie fights the Mexican family. But perhaps I'm missing something. Or maybe I'm completely missing the point here and I'm trying to pull an interpretation out of my ass. But in any case, I looked at the movie through this lens and it helped me appreciate it a lot more knowing that it's grounded in the reality of the human experience. If you've stuck around my needlessly long discussion up until this point, I don't think I need to say that I think this movie is damn good. Not so damn good is The Return of the Living Dead Part 2. I can't say I was exactly excited to watch this, and I'm not so happy to report that my fears were warranted. There's really no point in going over the plot of this, as it's basically a retread of the first movie in a lot of ways. A canister of gas gets broken open by a group of twerpy kids and we get a zombie movie. Only this time, it's surrounding a bunch of children and teenagers running around in a suburb. And if that seems like a real step down from the settings and characters of the first movie, it's because it is. This movie is so dull. While the original movie is very fun and even thrilling at times, this one does not deliver on either of those fronts. It certainly understands that the appeal of the first movie was the goofy camp, but it doesn't really know how to execute that. Harming it further is the cast and setting, which basically turned this into a toothless family film where we are subjected to scenes of an older sister chasing her younger brother around the house in the midst of a zombie apocalypse. And trust me when I say that sounds a lot more entertaining than it actually is. I honestly have no clue why they thought setting the sequel in a suburb with a bunch of kids was a good idea. It sucks all of the life out of the movie. If the first movie had punk rock energy, this has babysitter energy. As in, you could turn this movie on for a child you're babysitting and the parents probably wouldn't have a problem. Everything about it suggests that it's trying to appeal to children. I could show this to an 8-year-old and they probably wouldn't be scared. The movie is not very graphic. There isn't a lot of gore or nudity like in the first film, and the humor is pretty kid-friendly. All around, it's such a toothless movie that it could probably air in the daytime on Cartoon Network and feel right at home. Once again, just bizarre choices all around for a sequel to a cult classic zombie movie that featured tons of gore and nudity. I genuinely do not understand the creative decisions here. The only real redeeming quality this has is James Karen, who returns from the first movie to play a new character. He's the only one of the actors in this that fully hams it up, but not even his performance is enough to save this from being an immediately forgettable experience. I wouldn't recommend watching this unless you need something to help you sleep. The Invisible Man would be my favorite Universal monster movie if the first two Frankenstein movies didn't exist, so I felt compelled to watch one of its sequels. The Invisible Man Returns follows a different character from the first film. It's about someone wrongfully accused of a crime who escapes punishment by agreeing to let a scientist turn him invisible, even though the drug will slowly drive him insane. I don't remember the plot of the first one very much, but I have a feeling I'll remember the story of this sequel for a long time. It hits you with pathos right out of the gate as the main character struggles with his decision. He bought freedom at the cost of his sanity, and perhaps even his humanity. As he loses his grip on reality, he goes on a quest for revenge to bring justice to those who wrongfully imprisoned him. It's a really good story, and one that focuses on the common universal monster theme of being a misunderstood outsider, as well as a struggle with one's own evil nature, with the added bonus of the villains being greedy capitalists who run a coal mine. You'd think that after so many films recycling these themes that they would get stale, but they're just so effective at getting you to empathize with the monster at the heart of the story that it never gets old. This movie is quite a bit funnier than the first. The first film was pretty dour and much closer to a horror movie, but Invisible Man Returns at times feels like a slapstick comedy special. Some of his attempts to get back at his enemies are downright cartoonish. At first I wasn't sure how I felt about this, but over the movie's runtime I came to appreciate it. The change in tone may have been a result of the Hays Code dictating what could and couldn't be in the film, but it does help it stand on its own legs and not feel like a retread of the first. However, this movie does have its shortcomings, mainly in comparison to the first. The special effects portraying the invisibility powers have taken a real dip here. Most of them are executed using a pretty standard method of shooting the same shot with and without the actor, then merging the two shots. And here, it's not even done particularly well, as the effect is pretty noticeable and you can often see the outline of the actor that was cut out of the shot. Other effects like objects moving on their own are even less impressive considering there's all kinds of ways to move an object without appearing to touch it. All of this just makes me appreciate the effects of that first film all the more. The execution of the invisibility in that film is impressive to this day, and is aged much better than the effects in the sequel. This movie also has another dopey ending that ends on a happy note for no reason thanks to the Hays Code. And it just cements for me how the Hays Code really ruined these monster movies, because part of an effective Universal monster movie is a dour ending. The themes of misunderstanding and social isolation don't really resonate as well when at the end everything works out for no reason at all. In any case, regardless of its shortcomings, The Invisible Man Returns is a good sequel, and I definitely recommend it. I've been interested in watching a few of the Hellraiser sequels for quite some time. I've seen the original, the second one, and the most recent reboot, but the rest of the franchise has somewhat escaped me. So I'm going to power through as many of the sequels as I can fit into the 31 movie limit of this video. First up was Hellraiser 3. This was the one I was most excited to watch because I had heard the most good things about it, and it lived up to the hype. This one has Pinhead trapped in a pillar of sculptures as he slowly releases himself by tempting people with their innermost desires. And it features a nightclub called the Boiler Room, which I can only imagine is named as such because it features so many bad bitches. I mean, we got hot news reporters, busty blondes, and goth babes in this joint. Hellraiser 3 features all of the gore and Judeo-Christian messaging about temptation that you would come to expect from this franchise. What sets it apart from Hellraiser 2 though is that it's a lot more fun, and the story is a lot more engaging, even if it sometimes doesn't make complete sense. It also gives Pinhead a backstory which I'm not really sure that I liked, but once again it made the movie more engaging and fun, so I got over it. There are some new Cenobites introduced in this movie, and I liked a lot of their designs, aside from one that I'm calling CD Head, which is just a dated design at this point. One Cenobite in particular provided a bunch of one-liners that really gave the movie a sense of campy fun.
That's a wrap.
One of the most surprising things about it was that it featured a live performance from a traditional heavy metal band despite the movie being released in 1992. If you're not a fan of rock and metal, the reason that's so unusual is that by 1992 that style of metal had completely been thrown to the wayside in favor of grunge rock and groove metal. So to see a more traditional heavy metal band here was a pretty welcome surprise. I would say it made the movie feel like a product of the 80s rather than the 90s, but unfortunately there are some elements of fashion here that definitely place this movie squarely in the 90s. Overall, this is probably my second favorite Hellraiser movie right under the original. Its campy fun really hit the spot for me. After watching the third one, I watched a few more starting with Hellraiser Bloodline, which is a very interesting movie. Not gonna lie, when this first started, I thought I was in for a real stinker. It has an opening scene set in space, which is a real eye roller since horror sequels set in space was a really bad 90s trend, and it featured some pretty rudimentary CGI to boot. However, I did not expect this movie to be a triple narrative between this space station, a toy maker in the 1700s, and an architect in the 1990s. The story here is surprisingly ambitious for the fourth movie in a horror series. It's about a toy maker from the 1700s who's commissioned to make the Hellraiser puzzle box, not knowing that it will be used as a portal to hell. As a result, his bloodline is cursed for eternity, and his descendants in 1996 and 2127 spend the movie trying to build a device that breaks the curse and sends the Cenobites back to hell. It's a really engaging story and saves the movie from being a total snooze. I do have my gripes with it though. Horror sequels trying to explain events, objects, and entities from previous films is one of my biggest horror sequel pet peeves. But the origin of the puzzle box was at least used in the story in a way that was integral to its progression and didn't just feel like needless lore expansion. I do feel that knowing the origin of the box takes away from some of the creepy mystery surrounding it, and the idea that a human made the box is pretty hard to believe considering that in several of the movies its transformations defy the laws of physics. But once again, it's used in the story in an integral way, and the movie tries its best to help the box retain its supernatural aura. The story is also pretty convoluted at times and can be a little too busy for its own good, but apparently this comes from studio-mandated reshoots that fundamentally change the movie's story and runtime. I'd be curious to know what the original story was exactly, but we will probably never know. Beyond the story, I really liked the body horror achieved through the makeup and special effects. The scale of the movie, along with its special effects, are pretty impressive considering it probably wasn't made on a particularly big budget. It also has some deliciously pulpy dialogue and one-liners from Pinhead and the other characters.
For God's sake, Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
Something else that I wanted to mention is that this is the second Hellraiser movie in a row that stars incredibly gorgeous women for no apparent reason. The cast of the third movie was just bafflingly attractive. In this movie, we have Valentina Vargas as Angelique, and she is very good as the character. Anyway, I'm gonna stop being horny on Maine and wrap up my thoughts on Hellraiser Bloodline by saying that it was surprisingly decent. The story and the effects are pretty ambitious for a low-budget sequel, even if the movie struggles to carry the weight of that ambition. Following Bloodline, Hellraiser Inferno was made and released straight to video, the first of many home video sequels in this franchise. I was expecting this to be a B-grade detective noir based on the opening minutes, but instead what I got was a Lynchian nightmare fest. Hellraiser Inferno is about a cop investigating a string of grisly murders and trying to hunt down the ring of criminals who committed them. It's a very different plot for a Hellraiser movie, but it works. The Cenobites here mainly reside in the surreal vision sequences and murder scenes. They're apparitions that the main character fruitlessly chases as he tries to solve these crimes. The typical Hellraiser trappings take a backseat here to a detective story that's genuinely engaging. On top of the murders themselves, you have a missing child in the mix, and the bizarre nature of the crimes and visions the main character experiences means that everyone around him becomes increasingly suspicious of his slipping sanity. It all concludes in a way that really surprised me. I honestly can't say too much about what I liked about this one without getting into spoilers, but it was a real surprise. Once again, not the kind of sequel I expected from this series, especially 5 movies in, but this is a refreshing approach that uses the Hellraiser mythos in a way not previously explored. Not so refreshing is the follow-up, Hellraiser Hellseeker. This one follows Mayhem from the Progressive car insurance commercials as he inadvertently becomes a chick magnet and has to fight against the scariest force in the world. Horny women. Honestly, that's the most coherent plot synopsis I can give you because the actual plot of this movie is very incoherent. It's about a man trying to find out what happened to his dead wife while having random hallucinations and being stalked by the aforementioned horny women. It shares a lot of similarities with Inferno since both are about investigations, both contain surreal sequences, and both have kills in them that incriminate the main character. The difference is, everything this movie tries to do falls flat. The mystery about the main character's wife is never engaging, his escapades with various women are just confusing because I'm not sure if they're supposed to be sexy or scary, especially since they're effective at doing neither. And when he's caught in incriminating situations, it doesn't feel like the stakes are rising because the investigation happening in the movie has nothing to do with him or the people it seems like he's killed. When this inevitably gets incorporated into the plot and bites him in the ass, it just feels like something that happens. And I'm all for creative reimaginations within a franchise, but I'm not really sure I can compliment or appreciate the direction this movie takes the traditional Hellraiser trappings. The Cenobites and anything to do with Hellraiser are barely present here, and are so inconsequential to the plot and themes that you could take them out of the movie and it would be the exact same aside from maybe the final scene. The final scene is also something I want to talk about, so if you don't want spoilers, you can skip to the time on screen. There's a plot twist during this scene where it's revealed that the main character is dead and his wife killed him in the opening scene. While this is being explained, the main character is being ripped apart by hooks, and Pinhead is trying to give some kind of moral lesson about adultery and betrayal. It all reminded me of Saw in a weird way, even though this predates Saw by 2 years. The plot twist itself wouldn't even be bad if it was built up to in a way that made sense. As is, it doesn't really make any sense and just feels like an ass pull for the sake of having the movie end on a plot twist like Inferno did. In the end, Hellseeker is a completely ineffective movie. Its scares aren't horrifying, its mystery isn't intriguing, and its sex isn't sexy. I was surprised that the Hellraiser movies were able to stay relatively solid for 5 straight movies, so the franchise was well overdue for a stinker of this kind. And with that, I think I can finally end my exploration of the Hellraiser series, knowing that I have reached the end of the good Hellraiser sequels. And also because if I try to watch the rest, I will go well over my 31 movie limit for this video. So, adios Hellraiser, I hope your future is better than your past. The last Universal monster movie I watched for this Spooktober challenge was Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and it's a pretty important Universal monster movie to end on because it's the first crossover film in the franchise. There were several after this, but Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman opened the door for other crossovers to happen, and it's a pretty good crossover. Functionally, the story and themes serve as a good sequel to the first Wolfman movie, with his quest for a cure naturally leading to the work of Dr. Frankenstein. We actually spend about half of the movie continuing Wolfman's story before we even see Frankenstein. So Frankenstein is in the title and he is in this movie, but let's be clear, this is a Wolfman movie. In a role reversal, the man who once played Dracula and even Igor alongside Boris Karloff's version of the character is now playing Frankenstein's monster. Balin does a great job in the role, and while I don't like his version of the character as much as Karloff's, he also isn't given as much material to work with. As I said before, this is a Wolfman movie through and through, and while it does make the movie stronger as a whole, it relegates Frankenstein's monster to the background. My only real complaint with the movie is that in the second half, the plot kind of lost me and I struggled to understand where exactly it was headed. But that may or may not have had to do with the fact that I stayed up late to squeeze this movie into my day when I watched it, so I was pretty drowsy. In any case, it's all made up for with the pretty exciting finale where Frankenstein and Wolfman really go at each other for about 5 minutes before the whole place explodes. It's probably the best ending out of these Hayes-era monster sequels, and I'm relieved that they were finally able to get away from having a dopey-ass ending for at least one of these, because the final scene of this movie was pretty kick-ass, and delivered on exactly what the poster promised. Alright, and that's it. That's the video. It doesn't have any larger point or narrative that I wanted to weave. This is just something that I wanted to do for several years. I did the original Vandalizing Spooktober back in 2019, and ever since I did that, I was like, I want to do this again, but with just sequels. And I thought that was going to be a fun and cool idea. Obviously, I did it different from the first time, because the first time I actually was watching one movie every day in October. I don't have the time to do that anymore. And that's the main reason why it took me so long to do it again, was I was wanting to do it in that exact same way. But eventually, around the end of last year, I realized that if I'm going to do it, I'm just going to have to watch all the movies in advance, spread over months. And so that's what I did. So if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. And special thanks to all of the guests who made an appearance in this video. You know, a lot of these people I've either been friends with or became friends with because I ran into them, you know, as I was making this and wanted them to be involved. So, you know, special shout out to everyone who had a segment in this. If you enjoyed any of the guest segments here, their channels are going to be linked down in the description. I honestly spent way too much time making this, but it's okay because it was a good break after making the Steel Garden and was really the perfect little project for me to piddle away at this year. I wasn't personally in a place for most of this year where I could be working on anything bigger. Speaking of working on things, I know previously I had announced that I was going to do a YouTube video on the exploitation director Russ Meyer entitled The Best Director Ever. And some of you got really excited for that. I just wanted to say I am still working on that. I know initially I wanted to release it this summer. Obviously summer is over, so it's not out, but I am still working on it. But at some point during this year, I realized that if I was going to do it right, it probably wasn't going to get done this year. And so I made my peace with that and just decided to just focus on Vandalizing Spooktober, the sequel, but that is still coming, but it might not be in the form of a YouTube video. If you know anything about Russ Meyer and anything about exploitation movies, you know that the content of those movies is not exactly YouTube friendly. So I wouldn't want to put a lot of effort into a project just to upload it onto a website that isn't receptive to it, and then it gets taken down and nobody can watch it. That's not what I want. So I'm going to explore other options as to what I can do with this project. And yeah, I'll try to keep you guys posted. In terms of this YouTube channel, I'm not really sure the direction I want to take with it at this point. I do enjoy engaging in online conversations with everybody. I like being a part of that internet community, but also don't feel like putting in as much effort into engaging with that conversation as I have in the past. I would like my energies to be focused on other things that are going to push me towards the work that I want to do and the life that I want to have. With that being said, I've been sort of touring around with the idea of opening up a second channel where it's just sort of like this, where I just sit down in front of a camera and talk about different things. If you're open to that idea, let me know in the comments, or let me know if you're open to seeing those kinds of videos from this channel, from Randall the Vandal, because I think that's what I would like to do moving forward if I'm going to keep making videos, is just sit down in front of a camera and talk about something, because there are things I would like to talk about online, but I just don't feel justified in spending as much time on it as I have videos in the past. So let me know what you think of that idea, whether that be on a second channel or on this channel. And thank you guys so much for watching. As always, I'm Randall the Vandal, and as I said before, thank you for watching.